Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hi there, welcome to the 6th week of our course Elements of Literature and Creative Communication. Last week we discussed Indian English poetry. Beginning with its roots, we traced Indian English poetry through the poetry of Nizam Ezekiel, Arun Kolatkar, Dilip Chitre, Aurobindo, Kamala Das and all these poets. And now in this week we are going to discuss contemporary world poetry. Before we discuss contemporary world poetry, we need to understand the concept of world literature as such, because in the traditional disciplines of humanities and social sciences, world literature or studies related to world literature are gaining popularity these days. Therefore, let us quickly take a look at the concept of world literature itself and then move on to contemporary world poetry. The moment we talk of world poetry as a distinguished discipline in the humanities in general and literature in particular, we invariably think of Goethe, because the concept of world literature as we understand the term today is attributed to Goethe. And Goethe, as all of us know, was the national poet of Germany. He was not just a poet, again a versatile personality. He was a playwright, a novelist, scientist, statesman, all these things. So, the contribution of Goethe to German society and culture is invaluable, and therefore, he is rightly considered the father of German literature in a broad sense, of course. Other words, he is considered as a national poet of Germany. As a concept, world literature as a concept is something like a cultural expression of a political, geopolitical world order, one in which the world has moved beyond narrow confines of nationalism and colonialism, and of course, these were what dominated these colonialism and nationalism dominated the 19th century discourse. As a kind of breaking away from that kind of imperialistic discourses, world literature emerged. So, that is the background in which world literature emerges. Okay. In fact, it begins as a story. We can discuss the origin of Goethe's concept of world literature as a kind of a story. Sometime in 1827, Goethe was interacting with his secretary cum friend cum confidante and all that, called his friend cum confidante was Johann Eckermann. One day when Johann Eckermann, as usual, when he went to meet Goethe, he found Goethe in a peculiar mood. So, he asks him the reason behind that, and that is when Goethe says, in fact, before Eckermann entered the room, Goethe had just finished reading a Chinese novel, obviously in translation. Of course, it is also true that Goethe was a polyglot, but this particular Chinese novel was available to him through an English translation, and he had just finished reading it. And he said something remarkable about Chinese literature and Chinese novel. And Eckermann thinks that it must be really unusual, because remember, in the West, the concept of novel was something late 16th century or early 17th century, whereas in most of the Eastern traditions, including India, our first ventures into the very genre of novel or in the form of novel were quite earlier. Therefore, Goethe remarks that no, in fact, the concept of novel is quite old as far as Chinese culture was concerned. and by then of course he was also familiar with works of Kalidasa, especially Shakuntala, and he was greatly influenced by the Persian poet Hafiz. So, backed by his understanding and familiarity with all these writers, Goethe remarks to Eckermann that national literature is now a rather unmeaning term. It has lost its significance because the epoch of world literature is at hand, and all of us must strive to hasten its approach. So, this is the remark that Goethe makes, the first remark, and that is when he uses the term in Germany, Weltliteratur, world literature. That is how world literature, the concept of world literature was born somewhere in a remote village or a small town in Germany called Weimar in 1827. All right. In order to understand the significance of the term, well, generally speaking, world literature in a contemporary sense refers to literary works that are translated into multiple languages and circulated to a wider audience outside their society of origin. Let us say, for instance, if a Hindi work is written, when it gets translated into Kannada, when it gets translated into Bangla, when it gets translated into Persian, when it gets translated into Japanese, that is when it has gained a kind of a wider circularity. So, that is when we can say that it has entered, the work of Hindi has entered into the portals of world literature. So, that is a commonsensical understanding. But in other words, it is a sum total of all national literatures. We can say that world literature is a sum total of all national literatures. And as far as a literary perspective and awareness is concerned, it creates a new cultural dawn, it creates a new literary dawn. And in terms of emergent global modernity, of course, we live in that, it also refers to a kind of literature where the entire world becomes its reader. Remember, we are living in a world, thanks to the technological interventions, we are living in a world that has shrunk the globe into a village. That is why we call it a global village, right. Therefore, everybody should have access to any great work of art. So, the term signifies all these important concepts. World literature also has its supporters in the works of Fritz Stritch and Marx and Engels, especially. Marx and Engels, their important contribution. In fact, Marx and Engels considered their manifesto to be a work of world literature. It comes out sometime in 1830s and 40s. So, they considered their manifesto as a prototype of world literature. That is why you find Marx and Engels making a remark that world literature is the quintessential literature of modern times. And they have understood the pitfalls of national one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness, and therefore, as a kind of a way out, they propose the concept of world literature. And today, more than looking at world literature as a sum total of all the works that are available in available for reading to the entire population of the globe, we consider world literature more as a kind of a network of ideas, cultural exchanges and things like that. Yeah, David Damrosch, a remarkable scholar and professor in the University of Harvard, has a major role to play in revitalizing the concept of world literature in the contemporary times. Especially in the 21st millennium, he has played a major role in popularizing world literature as a distinct discipline to be studied across the globe in various departments of literatures and languages. He defines world literature as something that encompasses all literary works that circulate beyond their culture of origin, either through translations or maybe in their original language, because if there is a reader who can read Hindi even outside India, even then of course the work in Hindi has gained an audience outside India, and through that reader it might as well reach other readers. So, we can say that is entered the portals of world literature as such. So, he identifies, Damrosch identifies two stages through which a work of art enters into a global domain, two rites of passage in order for a work to be considered world literature. First, by being read as great literature, it should be considered as a classic or a great work of art in the language, in the region, in the culture in which it is written, and second, by circulating out into a broader world beyond its linguistic and cultural point of origin. Of course, here we make use of translation and other things. Here comes his important works as far as world literature is concerned, beginning with his work, What is World Literature?, which was published in 2003. He went on to write How to Read World Literature, and later in 2014, World Literature in Theory. Okay. So, he goes on to say that world literature is a mode of socio-political, literary, cultural circulation and reading. And of course, like there is never a set of the canon of world literature. The intention behind world literature is not to create a new canon of literature as such. Instead, like there is no single way of reading a text, there is also no single way of defining world literature. Broadly speaking, any great work of art, that by virtue of translation or by virtue of extensive readership has gone beyond the point of its origin and is available to the reader of the world is called world literature as such. The moment we say world literature, a couple of concerns come to our mind. The first concern is what happens to authenticity. Well, there are many critics who say that the moment you take a work out of its particular locale, remember we said that a work of art is a product of a cultural background in which it is written, the tradition, an entire tradition, an entire society, culture, fauna, flora, everything will have gone into making a particular work of art. So, when you take it out of its context, what happens? Does it lose its authenticity? Does it lose its specificity? So, these are some questions. Therefore, allaying these fears and concerns, proponents of world literature say that rather than losing, a work gains when it becomes a part of world literature. Of course, in the process it has to necessarily undergo certain transformations or metamorphosis through global circulation. It is not that the work would be received. Let us say for instance, there is a classic written in Kannada literature. It is not that when it is translated and published outside Karnataka, it will be received in the same way it was received in Kannada. It has to undergo certain transformation, and in the process it is bound to lose a few things and it is also bound to gain a few things. So, these are the natural things, and that is why in fact Walter Benjamin, a renowned translator scholar, translator theorist, he goes on to coin the term called afterlife. Through translation, a work acquires an afterlife, because if we consider a work in the source language as having life, when you translate that work, then what happens? That work gains an extra lease on life, or it appears as a kind of an alter life. It appears in the form of an alter life in another language, right? Therefore, it gains to when a work of art enters part of world literature, it gains an afterlife. You can also consider it as that. World literature also becomes an extraordinary tool, a remarkable tool in analyzing globalization. We are struck in the concept of globalization. It has many ramifications. Globalization has been studied extensively from an economic point of view, from sociological point of view, but not so much from cultural and literary point of view. Therefore, world literature provides an interesting set of tools to look at the concept of globalization in a fresh perspective, from a cultural perspective. This is where we can come to the concept of literature as a single living organism. This is Rabindranath Tagore's concept. Like Goethe, Rabindranath Tagore too had understood the concept value of world literature quite at an early stage, maybe right in 1903, he seemed to have remarked that cutting across the national boundaries, literature as such exists as a single organism in an interconnected universe. Therefore, it becomes a part of the global tradition. So, these are a couple of concerns that we can keep in mind as far as world literature is concerned when it enters through translation. Yeah, Goethe, continuing our discussion of Goethe. Goethe was he was not very happy reading his own works, and criticism of his works in German. That is when he seemed to have remarked, I do not like to read my Faust anymore in German, But on the other hand, he is interested in its appearance, let us say in French, because in French it acquires a fresh taste, a fresh color, and in a different spirit. Therefore, when a writer comes across his own works having appeared in different language, it is going to revitalize the spirit of the writer as well, and moreover a work will reveal several features that were hidden even from the author. So, that is why I said that when a work of art enters world literature portal, it is going to reveal very many things. All right. So, and of course, here comes the concept of mirroring. When more than a reflection, what happens when a work gets translated into other languages and thereby enters the parlance of world literature, it acquires a kind of a refraction, more than reflection of the original work or the so called source work, there is a refraction of that, and that is when it provides new insights to the writer who has written this. Okay. This is for all his pride in his own achievements and those of his fellow friends, Goethe has an uneasy sense that German culture is provincial. Of course, that is what major writers felt, right? Even Tagore was quite skeptical of the entire nationalistic fervor. Therefore, he proposes the concept of cosmopolitanism. Through his poetry, he proposes universalism. An individual as a product of universal, an individual more than a nationalistic dimension. An individual should appear as a kind in a universalistic dimension. That is when he or she can grow. That was Tagore's concept. That was true of Goethe as well. And all these great writers at one point of time, when they were really fed up of the provincial culture, nature, criticism, that is when they aspire that their work grows out of the national borders and reaches a wider audience across. Okay. That is why we say that a work, when it enters world literature, acquires a new lease on life. It is a new horizon for a work, right? It is a new horizon for a work. So, one of the poets who translated from English into Kannada, B.M. Shrikantaya, he says that in his preface to his translation, which is also in the form of a poem, he says what he has done through these translations is to look at to decorate Kannada using the clothes of English and see how the Kannada lady looks and things like that. So, in other words, what he is talking of is cross fertilization between two cultures, two literatures, and as a result a new lease on life that literary work gains. And it is also, of course, a very important thing when a work gets censored in one part of the globe, obviously because of its virtue of being world literature, or as by virtue of being a part of world literature, it can be read in other parts. So, when a particular regime tries to suffocate a literary work, it finds a new life, a new birth in other languages. All right. So, these are some advantages of it. Of course, it is not any concept has its flip sides too. Therefore, many critics, many prominent ones, including Gayatri Spivak, are not very happy with this kind of sudden spurt in world literature and all that. Therefore, I mean, they feel that, you know, there is a kind of an erasure of local literary traditions and cultures, because remember, this is the guise in which imperialism was furthered. Okay. Translation, we have already read extensively how through translations of the Orient, imperialist agenda was furthered. All right. Therefore, critics, subaltern critics have every reason to be anxious of the fact that through the guise of world literature, neo-colonial agenda might as well be creeping in, and therefore it might be robbing our own native cultures. So, it has a valid fear. And moreover, well, when you say world literature, what do you mean by world literature? Probably you are talking of you know, when a work is available in English, that is when it becomes world literature, because otherwise how does it happen? It is not that you know, a work of art, though it is written in Bangla or you know, Odia, it becomes a part of world literature. Of course, unless through translation, there is no way through which a local word becomes world literature. So, in other words, it is like surrendering to European American tastes and standards. So, if a work of art does not fit into that standard, however great that work of art may be in a local culture, that does not become a greater work. Say for instance, that is how a poet such as Bendre, in the Kannada context, you know, we call him, his poetry is as good as poetry of Pablo Neruda. Whereas, because his works are not translated properly, and of course, they are so steeply rooted in the native culture that it becomes difficult to translate them into English successfully, and even if you translate them, they become caricatures, right. Therefore, through the process of translation, we also have, I mean, we also have to run the risk of losing our canons into secondary works. That is when the world may perceive it as secondary work, whereas in the culture that has produced it, they are extraordinary works. So, these are some concerns that we have. However, by keeping these concerns in hand, we have to discover ways of moving ahead and making available our great works of literature into a wider audience. So, these are some things that we have to keep in mind. Keeping this spirit, what we are going to do in this week, we are going to take up some extraordinary works that are written in different regions, different national cultures, different provincial cultures, and fortunately which are available in English, and we are going to discuss some of these works so that we also get a taste of how they sound, you know. So, keeping the spirit of world literature in mind, we are going to introduce world poetry through translation. So, next class we come up with some major global poetry available to us in English translation. Until then, take care. Bye bye.